Turning our attention to something that's confronting millions of people. That has to do with the rent. Americans have had to cover 4 months of rent since the pandemic crisis began. But with so many out of their jobs, what exactly does the state of rent payment look like? And what would happen if we were to go another few months without being able to pay for the roof over our heads? It's time for Yahoo You. Brian Cheung is joining us to discuss this.
Well, Adam, it's been a few months since lockdowns began across the country, and we know the numbers already, right? 11.1% unemployment with 18 million people remaining on unemployment insurance, as we saw from the numbers yesterday. But the question is really going to be, how will all those people pay rent, and what will happen to them if they don't? And what I'm showing you here is the breakdown of whether or not renters were able to pay their rent in full in July. This comes from the apartment list. And what you can see here is that 32% of all renters nationally failed to make rent payments in full. In fact, 19%, highlighted by the purple section of this bar, made no payments at all. And that share has been steady across the 4 or so months that we've been enduring this lockdown. Now, unfortunately, the burden of rent payments have fallen more heavily on the lower income, especially in the urban areas. High rent is a massive weight, as we know, on those making specifically less than $30,000 a year. So for this group, as you can see from the purple section, over 40% of their earnings go straight into rent. And also, as we know, this crisis has disproportionately affected workers who are Hispanic, Black, and women, which makes this crunch even more targeted and disproportionate relative to those that are higher income. Now, the hope is that unemployment insurance can help these people pay the rent and also afford basics like food. And keep in mind that Congress does still have that extra $600 a week in unemployment insurance, but only through the end of this month, which means that that 32% rate figure that I just showed you, that actually could get worse if those benefits do expire. Now, so far, though, landlords haven't been able to really do much about this. According to the Eviction Lab, these 19 states that are highlighted in front of you, and including the Washington, D.C. district, have moratorium on enforcing evictions. So for a while, it wasn't even really possible to take a tenant to court because the courts themselves were closed. But with reopening, some courts are open again, and the moratorium have been lifted. One example is in Milwaukee and Wisconsin. Data from the Eviction Lab shows that eviction filings have spiked 15% since the moratorium was lifted. Now, many, I do want to note, might not even want to evict in the first place. I mean, one big question is, where else will you find a renter with everyone out of a job, even if you do evict a tenant that's not paying rent? But the ripple effects go up to the landlord as well. There's a lot of pressure on them. And in New York City, for example, tax payments for the past few months were due last week, July 1st. Here in New York City, the Community Housing Improvement Program, what they call CHIP, did a survey a few weeks ago asking rent-stabilized building landlords, so a subset of all buildings, if they expected to meet those payments, and the numbers were not so good. You can see almost 40% of them said they're going to struggle to pay the bill in full, and almost 6% said they wouldn't be able to make any tax payments at all whatsoever. Now, I do want to note that for small landlords on a certain billing cycle, New York City won't charge interest on any missed tax payments, at least through September. But who knows what's going to happen by that point in time. And that's also a patch that may not be available in other cities and states. So what's the implication of all of this, right? If landlords can't pay their taxes, the threat is going to be foreclosure on the property. And who's going to snatch that up? Likely large corporate property managers with large enough coffers who can afford to buy a tenant building in the middle of a crisis. And as of a few years ago, this is data from 2015, a little dated, but just over a hair, over half, that's about 25.8 million of rental units in this country were managed by corporate landlords instead of individual landlords. So with this crisis, the threat of foreclosures really means that the types of landlords that renters pay money to may shift. And that may push a deeper majority towards those corporate landlords as opposed to individual landlords. But I do want to throw it over to our reporter, Akiko Fujita, who I know you've been talking to on the ground, renters and also landlords, and hearing about the eviction wave that could be confronting us. What have you been seeing on that front?
Yeah, Brian, you talk about the ripple effects here from renters who can't pay to then landlords who can't collect rent and then the foreclosures. And it really is, you get the sense that this is just kind of the beginning of a broader wave that's happening. On the eviction front, to your point, there is still a federal moratorium in place for federal housing. So we're talking about just 30% of the homes that are rented are covered. But there's a lot of states that have already lifted the moratorium, and we have seen an impact already. You mentioned Milwaukee with that 15% spike. One of the more troubling places that I've seen is in Memphis. Shelby County there has 9,000 cases. That's the backlog they're looking at in terms of evictions. This, of course, isn't just because it's because of COVID, but those cases that were basically paused as a result of COVID. So when you look at what happened pre-COVID, 8 million renters who are living paycheck to paycheck, and then now you look at what's happening as a result of those people who have lost their homes, we're talking about possibly 20 million renters who could be evicted by the end of September. And that's a number that's come out from the COVID eviction defense coalition, which has been created from a lot of legal advisors who are saying there's a huge wave that's coming. And one thing I think it's important to note, a lot of times we talk about evictions as if that's just an issue for those who are of low income. But what I heard increasingly from these community organizations is that they're getting a lot of calls from people who used to make high five, six-figure salaries who simply just didn't have any savings left. And so in a place like the 211 call centers that offer social services, their call volumes are increasing, but also the length of those calls are also increasing, because now you've got people who have never sought out these services, who are trying to find a way to stay inside their homes.
Hey investors, Zach Guzman here. Are you interested in learning more about the markets and getting the latest financial news? Well, then click right here to subscribe to our Yahoo Finance YouTube channel. Get the latest up-to-the-minute market analysis, big interviews in the world of finance, and information on how to manage your money every day wherever you are.